Good morning and welcome to our Sunday presentation. United Lodge of Theosophists, Washington, D.C. meets every Sunday at 11 a.m. for the discussion of a particular topic. Today's presentation will be on what is truth, and next week the topic will be Pythagoras. Please also note that we meet every first and third Sunday of the month at 12:30 p.m. to read and discuss selected theosophical writings. We're currently having roundtable discussions on the Bhagavad Gita. Our lodge, United Lodge of Theosophists, is guided by its declaration, which states the following. The policy of this lodge is independent devotion to the cause of Theosophy, without professing attachment to any theosophical organization. It is loyal to the great founders of the theosophical movement, but does not concern itself with dissensions or differences of individual opinion. The work it has on hand and the end it keeps in view are too absorbing and too lofty to leave it the time or inclination to take part in side issues. That work and that end is the dissemination of the fundamental principles of the philosophy of Theosophy, and the exemplification in practice of those principles through a truer realization of the self, a profounder conviction of universal brotherhood. It holds that the unassailable basis for union among Theosophists, wherever and however situated, is similarity of aim, purpose, and teaching, and therefore has neither constitution, bylaws, nor officers, the sole bond between its associates being that basis. And it aims to disseminate this idea among Theosophists in the furtherance of unity. It regards as Theosophists all who are engaged in the true service of humanity, without distinction of race, creed, sex, condition, or organization, and it welcomes to its association all those who are in accord with its declared purposes, and who desire to fit themselves, by study and otherwise, to be the better able to help and teach others. The true Theosophist belongs to no cult or sect, yet belongs to each and all. Today's reading comes from the voice of the silence. Help nature and work on with her, and nature will regard thee as one of her creators, and make obeisance. And she will open wide before thee the portals of her secret chambers, lay bare before thy gaze the treasures hidden in the very depths of her pure virgin bosom. Unsullied by the hand of matter, she shows her treasures only to the eye of spirit, the eye which never closes, the eye for which there's no veil in all her kingdoms. Then will she show thee the means and the way, the first gate and the second, the third up to the very seventh, and then the goal, beyond which lie, bathed in the sunlight of the Spirit, glories untold, unseen by any save the eye of soul. Before thou canst approach the foremost gate, thou hast to learn to part thy body from thy mind, to dissipate the shadow, and to live in the eternal. For this, thou hast to live and breathe in all, as all that thou perceivest breathes in thee, to feel thyself abiding in all things in self. Thou shalt not let thy senses make a playground of thy mind. Thou shalt not separate thy being from being and the rest, but merge the ocean in the drop within the ocean. So shalt thou be in full accord with all that lives, bear love to men as though they were thy brother pupils, disciples of one teacher, the sons of one sweet mother. Of teachers there are many, the master soul is one alaya, the universal soul. Live in that master as its ray in thee. Live in thy fellows as they live in it. Before thou standest on the threshold of the path, before thou crossest the foremost gate, thou hast to merge the two into the one, and sacrifice the personal to self-impersonal, and thus destroy the path between the two, antaskarana. And now for today's talk.
Thank you, friends. The ancient message of what is truth that H.P. Blavatsky passed on to us over 100 years ago is as critically needed today as ever. Today's presentation includes as many of her words as possible within the limitations of the time allotted for this talk. A picture of this board is at the end of today's video. So if you have trouble reading it, just look at the end and it'll be there. HPB quoted poets who said that truth is the voice of nature and of time. Truth is a startling monitor within us. Naught is without it. It comes from the stars, the golden sun, and every breeze that blows. And another poet, fair truth, immortal sun, is sometimes hid in clouds. Not that her light is in itself defective, but obscured by my weak prejudice, imperfect faith, and all the thousand causes which obstruct the growth of goodness. HPB referenced the story of the biblical Jesus remaining silent when Pilate asked him what truth is, and Jesus saying to his disciples in Mark chapter 4, verse 11, quote, "Unto you is given the mystery of the kingdom of God, but unto them that are without, all things are done in parables." Over the years, there has been gradual dogmatism and assertion in churches and science under the form of divine revelation and scientific authority, forced on and accepted as fact by the profane multitudes, too busy to think for themselves and not knowing that in every age there have been sages who had mastered the absolute and yet could teach but relative truth. If we look at number 1 here, the whole and the final truth cannot be given to another man, for every one of us has to find that final knowledge in himself, self-knowledge. As no two minds can be absolutely alike, each has to receive the supreme illumination through itself, according to its capacity, and from no human light. The greatest adept living can reveal of the universal truth no more than the mind he is impressing it upon can assimilate. There are as many opinions as there are people. And looking at number 2 here, the sun is one, but its beams are numberless, and the effects produced are beneficent or maleficent, according to the nature and constitution of the objects they shine upon. And looking at number 3, in proportion as our consciousness elevates toward absolute truth, so do we assimilate truth more or less absolutely. Man's consciousness is the sunflower of the earth. Longing for the warm ray, the plant can only turn to the sun and move round and round in following the course of the unreachable luminary. Its roots keep it fast to the soil, and half its life is passed in the shadow. Still, each of us can relatively reach the sun of truth even on this earth. To achieve this, there are 2 methods. On the physical plane, we may use our mental polariscope and analyzing the properties of each ray, an infinite number, choose the purest. Our second is, on the plane of spirituality, we must work in dead earnest for the development of our higher nature. We know that, looking at number 4, by paralyzing gradually within ourselves the appetites of the lower personality and thereby deadening the voice of that physiological mind, so that the animal man in us may make room for the spiritual, and once aroused from this latent state, the highest spiritual senses and perceptions grow in us in proportion and develop along with the divine man. This is what the great adepts, the yogis in the East, and the mystics in the West have always done and are still doing. But with few exceptions, no man in the world, no materialist, will ever believe in the existence of such adepts, or even in the possibility of such a spiritual or psychic development. Real Theosophy is addressed to those who know in their hearts that masters of wisdom do exist, and though absolute truth is not on earth and has to be searched for in higher regions, that there still are, even on this silly, ever-whirling little globe of ours, some things that are not even dreamt of in Western philosophy. HPB noted that though general abstract truth is the most precious of all blessings in this day and age, many must be satisfied with relative truths. The most of us are as incapable of seeing abstract truth as of reaching the moon on a bicycle. Firstly, because absolute truth is immovable, and even the prophet has to go to it himself. And we have to follow suit if we would approach it even at a distance. Secondly, because the kingdom of absolute truth is not of this world, while we are too much of it. And thirdly, because notwithstanding that in the poet's fancy, man is the abstract of all perfection, which the workmanship of heaven hath modeled, in reality he is a sorry bundle of anomalies and paradoxes, an empty windbag inflated with his own importance and with contradictory and easily influenced opinions. He is at once an arrogant and a weak creature, which, though in constant dread of some authority, will yet, like an angry ape, play such fantastic tricks before high heaven as make the angels weep. HPB continued, quote, as physical man, limited and trammeled from every side by illusions, cannot reach truth by the light of his terrestrial perceptions, we say, develop in you the inner knowledge. From the time when the Delphic oracle said to the inquirer, man, know thyself, no greater or more important truth was ever taught. Without such perception, man will remain ever blind to even many a relative, let alone absolute truth. Looking out here, number 5. Man has to acquire the inner perceptions which never deceive before he can master any absolute truth. To reach the state during which man sees and senses it, we have to paralyze the senses of the external man of clay. To approach even terrestrial truth requires, first of all, love of truth for its own sake. For otherwise, no recognition of it will follow. And who loves truth in this age for its own sake? How many are prepared to search for, accept, and carry it out in the midst of a society where anything that would achieve success has to be built on appearances and self-assertion and not on reality and intrinsic value? In HPV's century of steam and electricity, followed by our current age of IT advances and artificial intelligence, man lives at an increasingly maddening speed that leaves him virtually no time for reflection. Man allows himself to be drifted down from cradle to grave, nailed to custom and conventionality. HPV calls conventionality a congenital lie, as it is in every case a simulation of feelings according to a received standard. And where there is any simulation, there cannot be any truth. Looking at number 6 down here. Truth is a gem that is found at a great depth. Whilst on the surface of this world all things are weighed by the false scales of custom. As many who, even when willing and anxious to learn, dare not accept the truths they long for fear of the ferocious sacrifices demanded of what is called society. When we draw a picture of modern society, of modern politics, of modern religion, and modern life in general, from our own observations and accounts of others, we see that everywhere where the white man has carried the, quote, benefits of so-called civilization, we cannot find a single exceptional spot on the globe where truth is the honored guest and lie and sham the ostracized outcast. Does not the great majority opt for the paradise of do-nothings, the imaginary place created by heartless selfishness? It is this majority that recoils in terror-stricken before the most shadowy outline of every new and unpopular truth out of mere cowardly fear, lest someone should denounce, condemn, and run us piecemeal by murderous tongues. And looking at number 7. Selfishness, the firstborn of ignorance, and the fruit of the teaching which asserts that for every newborn infant a new soul, separate and distinct from the universal soul, is created. This selfishness is the impassable wall between the personal self and truth. It is the prolific mother of all human vices, lie being born out of the necessity for disassembling, and hypocrisy out of the desire to mask lies. Selfishness kills every noble impulse in our natures. Hence we see it reign supreme in the world and in so-called fashionable society. As a result, we live and move and have our being in this god of darkness called respectability. We find in every nation, as in every individual, deceit and hypocrisy at work for dear self's sake. Nations, by tacit agreement, have decided that selfish motives in politics shall be called noble national aspiration, patriotism, so forth. Nevertheless, selfishness, whether it breeds desire for aggrandizement of territory or competition in commerce at the expense of our neighbor, can never be regarded as virtue. Such diplomacy, quote, by its right name might be called deceit or brute force. Cultured God and law-fearing aristocracy is forced to lie in order to cover what is pleased to term its small or relatively unimportant sins, but which truth regards as gross immorality. Society of the middle classes is honeycombed with false smiles, false talk, and mutual treachery. For the majority, religion has become a thin tinsel veil thrown over the corpse of spiritual faith. Even science, once the anchor of the salvation of truth, may be unaccepting of naked fact that it is against a current scientific hypothesis in our times. For many missionaries, how many missionaries in heathen lands or preachers at home are guilty of persuading congregations that modern geology is a lie, and evolution but vanity and vexation of spirit. Such was the actual state of things at 1888 AD, as recorded by HPB, at a time when some took she and her fellows to task for seeing that year in more than gloomy colors. Would HPB find that today's state of things have improved very much? HPB noted that outside of certain highly spiritual and elevated state of mind, during which man is at one with the universal mind, he can get naught on earth but relative truth, or truth from whatsoever philosophy or religion. Even the goddess of truth could give man no more than he can assimilate. Meanwhile, every patient person may occasionally get a reflection of some truth by gazing into the depths of that deep well named knowledge. But then we are warned that some philosophers seeking for truth to pay homage to her may have seen their own image and adored it instead. The constant reintroduction of Theosophy into the world serves to break the shackles of negative social conventions and religions. Truth is individually perceived, not collectively worshipped. The study of Theosophy does not in itself confer truth, nor is belief in Theosophy a substitute for knowledge. Yet it provides light upon the path, light by which the individual discovery of truth is made. Theosophy is a body of knowledge, as distinguished from the dogmas which form the basis of religion's creeds, from the hypotheses of the inductive sciences, and from speculative concepts upon which rest the many differing philosophical systems of the world. HPB and Mr. Judge passed on from the masters of wisdom signposts leading to the path of truth. This path is the living struggle to know and to feel truth in action. Truth is not a statement, nor a creed, nor any form of intellectual conception. It does not need formal proof, for it is its own demonstration. An inspiring religion inspires not because the events upon which it is presumably founded are inspiring, but because men may read in the symbolism of these events the perceptions and values true for them in the world of the present. So it must be that even the best of religions are forms that pass, of themselves merely negative or static aspects of truth. Theosophy differs from religions in that it drives a genuine student ever back upon himself for internal authority. But this cannot be said of theology, which teaches that the existence of the universe of both miracle, existence in the universe of both miracle and law. This strange antithesis can be accepted only on blind belief. A mind so servile to outside authority has made itself impervious to the real meaning of law and therefore of truth. Science has the idea of law in common with Theosophy, for science endeavors to describe the order of nature. A limited recognition of law is possible to the mind which reasons from premises to conclusions, the intellect of which science carries on its researches. But looking at number 9, higher mind alone recognizes the law and its majestic sweep through all worlds and can follow its operations beyond the veil of matter to the causal spheres of life. Denial of the existence of these planes forms the impassable gulf between modern science and genuine Theosophy. A gulf as deep and wide as is the very, looking at 10, difference between the lower kamic mind and the higher Buddhic mind. The perception of such hallmarks of truth calls for the, looking at 11, exercise of the higher powers of reason, that is synthesizing, not analytical, and is capable of looking directly upon ideas. It perceives directly and intuitively the unity of all life. The activity of the higher mind is not evoked by scientific experiments in a laboratory, nor by regarding nature as apart from us. All anthropomorphic religions are dualistic, an outside deity on the one hand and the universe on the other. God is the author and source of all good and an antagonist. The devil is the source of evil. Science divides nature into animate and inanimate, and thus far has been unable to bridge the gap between the two. To recognize that all is life and essentially one, the scientist must be something of a poet. He must feel his kinship with nature. Only when his heart joins with his mind in his search for knowledge will nature respond. Then only will she, as the first speaker read from the voice of the silence, open wide before him the portals of her secret chambers, lay bare her treasures before his gaze. Such kinship has its, looking at 12, obligations and duties inspired by one motive, to serve and to help all life without thought of self. By this means the heart or spiritual center of our being gains rapport with the great heart of nature. Look at number 14 here. Soul wisdom comes from conscious union. As we heard from the voice, before thou canst approach the foremost gate, thou hast to learn to part thy body from thy mind, to dissipate the shadow and to live in the eternal. For this thou hast to live and breathe in all, as all that thou perceivest breathes in thee, to feel thyself abiding in all things and all things in self. The perception of the fundamental identity of all souls with the universal oversoul is the beginning not only of true knowledge, but also of spiritual evolution. It is the vital centripetal power behind all progress. Knowledge of the unity of all life makes a man a fully responsible being, one of nature's co-workers and benefactors. And looking at number 14 here. Absolute truth and self-realization are one. The whole of life is but the drama of the soul. The purpose of this endless cycle of conditioned existence is the coming into manifestation of both spirit and matter. And looking at 15. The ever-attainable yet ever-receding goal of these cycles of activity is the complete expression of the spirit aspect of life through the matter aspect, and for self-conscious man, the realization of his oneness with the unchanging unity underlying the apparent diversity of conditioned existence. This realization is called, in the Secret Doctrine, paralyzing, the absolute perfection of which all existence is attained at the close of a great period of activity, or great period of activity in Mahamanvatra, and in which they rest during the succeeding period of repose. It is absolute, however, only in a relative sense, for it must give room to still further absolute perfection, according to a higher standard of excellence in the following period of activity, such as a perfect flower must die in order to grow into a perfect fruit. This stupendous development has neither conceivable beginning nor imaginable end. Secret Doctrine, Volume 1, pages 42 and 43. The universal intelligence inherent within life establishes the relation between spirit and matter, is that third aspect of life from which man derives his individualized mind, his I am I consciousness. St. Paul names this trinity spirit, soul, body. Theology calls it Father, Son, Holy Ghost. In other terms, it is spirit, mind, matter. Life in its simplest condition is at least dual. It has a physical and a metaphysical aspect, an inner nature and an outer nature. Any knowledge that hopes to become complete must take cognizance of both these aspects of life. That which cognizes is the third aspect. From this Trinitarian basis comes three approaches to knowledge. Looking at number 17. True religion, the study of the unity of life. True religion, the study of the purpose of life. And true science, the study of the processes or mechanics of life. But these three are approaches and no more. To reach and encompass knowledge, the perceptions gained by all three must be synthesized. The synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy is the Secret Doctrine. That ends the prepared presentation. We could talk about any point we want to talk about this mentioned so far, or
so then even the students all around the world who gather today to talk about these subjects, are they talking about relative truth?
it's we virtually, we all, you mentioned students, we are students. We recognize that as a fact. On the way to the path toward perfection, which even once we become an adept, it's a continuing process. So these are relative truths based on our own reality. Whatever we perceive from all of this, that's where we're at. It's our truth, but that changes. And until that truth doesn't change, we are dealing with primarily relative truth. That's what I'm thinking.
Well, may I ask another question? In your talk, you talked about the higher mind, but even today, science does not divide the mind into lower and higher conceptually, because they're not aware of a higher faculty than the intellectual aspect of the mind. So in your talk, if I understood it correctly, what is necessary is that higher mind be active and that it be enlightened through the Buddhic light, which is our highest perceptive power that does not depend on intellectuality of any kind. That it looks at ideas or whatever it is you want to know and shines on it and allows you to perceive what it is in its inner nature. So until such time then, you said at the end then, true religion, philosophy, and science, when combined together in a synthetic fashion, is the only mode that actually can lead you to the absolute truth.
That's how the student sees it, because intellectuality in this student's understanding is just the tool. And what happens is, as we are successful in our intellectual achievements, that becomes a false god, if you want. It gets to the point where it could be an obstacle more than a help. Because we have that gap, and until we acknowledge that, we have separate talks on higher mind, buddhi, manas, and atma, with the highest. But until we acknowledge that fact and recognize the spiritual within us, we are not going to make it. That's the way this student sees it.
Well, the student's understanding is that awakening process is an internal process that we can help people awaken to the inner truth, but you cannot really make them see it. They have to see it for themselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're all perceiving what these words are meaning in a little bit different ways, even though we may have been in this study for a whole lifetime.
It depends what sheath you're in and what is active in you as a human being that perceives it. You have to acknowledge that it's there first, and then try to become one with it. I think that is not perhaps achievable in one lifetime. It takes many lifetimes to do it in.
Yeah, we're talking of an immense period of time to the point where we have recognized and acknowledged this until we have achieved, quote, perfection, or get to the point where we are a sage of the age. This is a continuing process, and the things that we learn correctly go from life to life. So we see different children having different abilities and things like that. That's the development they're in from life to life. It's helping to get that understanding, to get that higher mind active and become one with the all, which is the universal mind. It's a continuing process, goes on for eons of time. We have separate talks on reincarnation and karma, in evolution. All that goes together. We have an impact. We're talking about periods where we're in an age of Kali Yuga now, the Dark Age. And that's 400,000 years, or something like that, 432. But that's just a guide. We can make it faster, or we can make it a lot longer. It's based on how much of this we're able to make real in our lives, not just learn it intellectually. That doesn't really help. But to become within us and to have our motive right and so forth, and our thinking correct. And then becomes the right action. Oh, you had.
Yeah, so by, truth being relative or subjective to the individual, I mean, I can kind of understand that now, because I always had like this thing about fact, fact, I guess science, you want to deal with fact a lot, religion, everybody, has different takes, and I guess you say as your time progresses, you progress in all of these, and to be able to understand that my truth may be different than someone else's, I can accept that, because we all had different paths to get where we are.
Because that's a relative truth.
Yes.
Yeah.
So can we say then that one of HPB's objectives was to activate those powers by not presenting them to the world, but also teaching it internally to her students? She had a group of students, which is at the end of one of those books that got published recently, the dialogues that she was having with her students. When you read those dialogues, it seems like her students 130 years ago must have been very advanced, because they seem to understand what is being discussed. The questions that they ask are very relevant to the issues they were discussing. But today, we are all left to sort of our own devices, if you wish, in reading the books and assimilating what we are reading independently on our own. Would you say that's a little bit more of a difficult process than actually having HPV on Earth teaching this stuff? Because she also had that higher mind Buddhi combination in her, and what she revealed to her students was from the absolute truth perspective.
Yes, well, she, she had already been developed, if you will, the higher aspect of her nature. Before she was, when she was born, she was developed. She came in with powers that's written in the books. So going from there, and also she had the influence of the masters, which is critically important. She had direct contact with the masters, and having direct contact and being, you would never absorb it, never understand it, unless you really were ready for it. But with her, because she was already developed to a great extent, and with the influence of the masters, and also their stories as though, they were directly with her when they were not visible to others.
I'm talking about her students.
Her students. Well, I'm thinking about her. It's kind of the background. Then she came in with the direct influence with her students. They certainly helped just by having her, but to a great extent, I think, by having her around them.
Well, she writes in the letters that we must never consider her not here.
Absolutely.
What I'm getting at.
Absolutely.
That the messenger and her colleague and the message go together, and one without the other is of no value to us. So that brings another point to the forefront, is the current that she establishes still with us.
Of course, it always is. It either comes to the forefront or not, or it goes to the background.
How do we contact it?
Well, there is said that we cannot get through all of these thresholds. We can go a long way in our thresholds. We have to do through our self-induced and self-devised methods, get us to a point where we can operate at that higher level. But we get help. And we get help from the current that you talked about. And that current, we have a way of individualizing that current, which is true, but if we think about it as just an individual, then we're missing the boat. That is something that is embodied by that individual while they're here in that body, and they continue on with that current when they're not here. So just because they're not physically sitting in a body that we're recognizing in this room doesn't mean they're not here. Certainly these great beings are with us continually. And but they can only do so much. Like the message today was, we have to pick the ball up, carry the ball. We have to, imbibe all this, and it's got to become us.
So would fact fall solely under science in all actuality? I mean, because would fact, like water boils at 212 degrees, would
Right.
that fall solely under science and not religion and philosophy?
Not necessarily. I mean, it's daytime, right? We can see each other. If it's darkness and so forth, I mean, those are facts, right? And that's also laws of nature. And it's also science, and it's also religion. Those things can, the way this student sees it, merge together. And the whole thing, you're talking about synthesizing. We kind of don't tend to do that too well. But that's when we synthesize the three, then that's when it becomes a fact, the truth. Scientists have gone to the Dalai Lama and tried to reconcile science and spiritual matters, and that's progress. They didn't totally get where they want to go. They talk back past each other a good bit, but that's an effort.
But in this philosophy, metaphysics comes into it.
Mm-hmm.
And in all of the philosophies of old, for instance, Zoroastrianism, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Sophia Pistis, Sophia, if that is how it's pronounced, they all tell us that there are seven principles in man and in the cosmos, and they are correlative to one another. So how then would we say that science knows the truth if their only experimentation is on the physical plane? Because this is the most material plane, and this is as solidified as we are ever going to be. In fact, what the Secret Doctrine tells us is that we're going to become less solid as the centuries go by. So, having said that, in order to then get to the truth that you're talking about, your synthesis has to be on all of the seven
Correct.
planes of existence, would it not?
You just answered your own question, I think. Because we look at ourselves as a body. That's wrong. We're partially a body. You know, I mean, that's our physical vehicle. But that's not all we are, because we have operated on, or we're going to operate on, 7 planes and 7 subplanes and so forth, and there's separate talks on that too. But this earth is the most material part of our journey. And we've come down to this earth from the highest levels, spiritual, to get experience. We've passed a little bit past the lowest point in the physical existence, but I think that this student mentioned there's several levels of this. Several, if you think about the universes, the 7 experiences we're going to have to get back to our original source. And it's not all, it's not all totally physical.
What they're interchangeable and interconnected.
Of course
Our
they are.
7 principles are not separate from one another.
They're not separate.
But we have to know what they are and understand it in order to get to the truth. Just on the physical plane, I think science has done tremendous work in bringing it to the forefront as to the constitution of the cell. However, they don't know the constitution of the atom. The atom is not what they say it is, because it is psycho-spiritual. Even the scientists you were referring to who went to Dalai Lama are now coming to the conclusion that they can only follow it so much and then it just disappears. Because according to this philosophy, if it's not on the physical plane, then it has gone on to a higher plane. So if you're just doing your experiment on this plane and the energy field disappears, it means it has moved on to a higher plane and it's not visible with these eyes. But we do have inner faculties to perceive those things that work on higher planes of our being. So perhaps HPB's other ideology was to make sure that the coming generations would have these faculties activated and functional, so that they could understand the books better.
Yeah. Well, HPB was positive on science, and she recognized that on a physical level they are making progress. They made a lot of progress since her day. There was things in the Secret Doctrine and ISIS that was new to the world, to the world of science. Since that time, there have been experiments to demonstrate these points.
Yeah.
So we have made what you might call a lot of progress, or what you might be calling a tiny amount of progress in the last 130 years in the world of science. We're making progress in dealing, some of the diseases that we have to deal with.
Well, I think
but in a limited way.
Scientists use such specialized words these days that ordinary people don't really understand what they're talking about. In her age, you could understand what was in the books, but even if you compare the 1950s to 1980s and not over 2000, almost 20, the terminology has significantly changed, and unless you're in that field, you really don't understand what they're talking about. And I think that is a camouflage. Anyone who wants to know the truth should be able to understand the terminology, and the way the scientists are writing it is not understandable.
That's true. Yeah. And why do you think it is that
life is very simple?
Especially in the 50s and 60s. Every other day, science was coming out as a new fact, and then they refute that the next day because they're not taking everything into account. The highest level is the spiritual level. They haven't figured out how to do that.
Well, the Secret Doctrine talks about two forces, that unless those two forces are in equilibrium, our Earth would not survive.
Sure.
The science today is still talking about magnetism only. That is the magnetic force that holds us here. They don't
the science of the day is being led, if you will, by the West, which is very materialistic. And then we have the East, which is takes these matters into account, but then they become very superstitious. So we have these two dichotomies going on.
Yeah, I understand. At the beginning, when I questioned, science, and then the first thing that popped in my mind was like, if you take water boiling at 212 degrees, water may not boil at 212 degrees in space. So science varies, and it has different contexts in different places. Whereas religion and philosophy, it's constant to a certain degree. Maybe
I'd like to know how philosophy and religion are constant.
I mean, it's not. It doesn't.
And the boiling point of water, science says it depends on the circumstances as to whether it boils at 212, okay, or not. And I think it's at sea level, above sea level, and below sea level.
Yes,
it can vary.
Yeah.
So,
does religion and philosophy vary?
That covered a bit. Religion and philosophy.
Does it vary too sometimes?
Philosophy generally still tends to be very materialistic, if this student understands it correctly. And religion is mired in dogmatic. You got to believe, okay. And if it's outside your realm of belief, then it's just as examples. You should take a look at these religious philosophers, if you will. They will make an argument. This is within the scope of what the church says. The church is learning to do things, broaden that scope to a degree, but still that argument as to what Jesus said, for example, is going to wind up being back to within the philosophy of that particular organization, whether it be church or something else. In education, we have the same problem with. We're sort of stuck in a rut. Western education, it does very good as it goes, okay, but we still, it seems like we're missing the boat a lot.
Yeah, that's what
we're learning as we go in education too.
There's also the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning, correct? From specifics to generals, and from generals to specifics. The student's understanding is Theosophy. HPB promoted from generals to specifics, and that's, I think she said, Plato's the one who did that. So there's also that difference as well. And I think Theosophy is from generals to specifics, and the student doesn't know how science goes about it, but if we're talking about science measuring only the objective plane, they would say, you know, we have instruments that can measure planes beyond our objective senses, you know, other spectrum of light, etc. They can detect with the instruments, and this student's understanding is, Theosophy would say, the human body is the greatest, you know, instrument to understand reality. So I think the focus is on us rather than instruments per se. I don't know if that's correct, but that's a comment I wanted to make.
Yeah, and you know, like I said, science is making progress, and we can learn so much by just looking at the body. But if we don't recognize from a general standpoint how this all fits, or, you know, have some concept, hypothesis, I think it's called in science. If we don't have an accurate hypothesis in the scientific terms, we're going to spin our wheels. We'll learn a little bit, but we're not going to have it in context.
Well,
because, you know, Theosophy says you start from general to specific, but you also go from specific to general. You have to do it both ways, and science is pretty good about going from specific within the context of the experiment, if you will. It works, but it might not work when you go outside of that context.
well, I think the Secret Doctrine says scientists are doing tremendous work, but she also says that as soon as the link is broken, they get lost because they cannot see on higher planes of our existence. But until science, I think, acknowledges the powers of the mind, we're not going to go. They're not going to go much further with it, because she does explain in the Secret Doctrine that the inner power that enables one to look at ideas, objects, and subjects directly is the third eye in the human being. And she names it the pineal gland. And until it is activated, she says it's active as a dormant gland, and it works, and it does its work, us unknowing as to what it does. But to cultivate it, she says, is one of the most difficult things to do, because you have to become a truthful person first, pure, and universal in your ideology, in the sense that you don't allow your personality to rule, but you allow the general well-being, altruistic ideology to rule. And until that reversal is come about, she says, that gland is not activated. It activates itself through service to humanity.
So I think what you talked about, the pineal gland, that also is a good example of our motives and thinking and so forth, how it affects us physically. Because we did have a third eye at one time, and it was visible. Now science sees it, but they don't know what it does. It really is dormant right now.
But
until we reactivate it, it will stay dormant.
Some of the fishes have it too, and it's under the skin. It's opaque and it's visible. So she says that nature never creates anything until it needs it. In other words, everything at one time had to be functional for those organs to be there. Without a function, they're not created. In our evolutionary process, I said created, but it really is not. Evolutionary process brings it about. Because we have fishes with eyes, but also in dark areas, the eyes become non-functional. They're not used anymore, so they are opaque. They're covered.
We see fishes don't have eyes and so forth at the lower level, or we don't see them anyway. But when you put them in a lighter environment, they develop them. That's why I was reading about that. But it's the same thing with the pineal gland. If we call forth the spiritual side of us, I think that
Well,
might
you can only
reactivate.
call it forth by service to humanity. In other
Service
words,
to
the
humanity,
personality
yeah.
has to some extent, be
Right.
overcome. And,
Right.
yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's the end of the station's talk today. Please join us for Pythagoras next week.